Hi, Professor Barati again. Some of the students have been asking for some explanation on how to, again, do some process costing, and they referenced one of the exhibits in the text. So I'm going to go through this exhibit, and I can see why it was a little challenging, because what this exhibit does, it throws in a little bit of a curve here. So all this exhibit does is it breaks out the conversion costs to equivalent units for its direct labor and factory overhead separately. And you will see this once in a while, and it's very feasible that a company's equivalent units as a percent complete may very well be different for direct labor or factory overhead, which you are given in this problem right here. So the approach here is just simply, instead of having conversion costs, you're breaking out your conversion costs into two columns, and you're doing a little more work, but it's essentially the same steps, the same theory. So let's just go through our problem quickly. Our physical units for work in process June 1st, which is our beginning WIP inventory, is 10,000 units. And it's saying that direct materials are complete 100% out of the beginning WIP. Direct labor is 30% complete, and factory overhead is 40% complete. Units started are 40,000, units to account for 50,000. As you know, units to account for our beginning WIP and our units started has to equal units to account for our ending WIP and work in process and completed. Our ending WIP inventory is 6,000, of which our direct materials are 100%, our direct labor is 50%, and our factory overhead is 60%. Now, if you're comfortable using this kind of layout, by all means. But I prefer a little more of a matrix. So let's do this. Let's start with our physical units. To summarize, beginning WIP, June 1st, is 10,000. Units started or transferred in is 40,000. Units to account for is going to be the sum. Bottom half will be WIP, ending WIP, June 30th, 6,000. Units completed, 44,000. Units to account for, is the summation, and they equal. So the bottom half equals the top half. This is again your T account, your debits and credits going through your WIP inventory control account. Now let's convert these to equivalent units. So part 2 is calculate equivalent units. So we have direct materials, and so far I've given you conversion costs. But here we're going to do conversion costs split up into direct labor and factory overhead. And basically we have our matrix. So now we're going to convert our physical units into equivalent units. Now the direct materials for beginning WIP of 100%. For direct labor, it's 30%. And for factory overhead, it's 40%. On the ending WIP, our direct materials are given to us to be 100%. But on direct labor, it's 50%. And factory overhead, 60%. So converting into direct materials, we'll do the ending and units completed first because we're going to do weighted average first. Ending WIP materials are going to be 6,000 because it's 100%. Now on to direct labor. The equivalent units of direct labor for ending WIP are 50% complete. So we're going to take 50% of 6,000, which is 3,000, and that's what your number is here. Now we're going to take 60% of factory overhead times 6,000, and the equivalent unit, did something wrong. The equivalent unit of ending WIP for factory overhead is not that, so let's get it right. $3,600, which is what you have here. Units completed, 100%. Therefore, direct materials, 100% of 44,000 units is still 44,000. A 100% of direct labor for completed units is still 44,000 and 44,000. Therefore, our weighted average equivalent units of production are the totals. Which is what they've derived here. Now we're going to do the same for the top half, but you don't have to for weighted average because this is already calculated, but I'm going to do it because the problem also has FIFO in it. And I'll explain this, why you have to do FIFO. But beginning, again, is 100%. Direct labor for physical units, beginning inventory of 10,000 is 30%. And factory overhead for beginning WIP of 10,000 units complete is 40%. Now, to get the units started, we know that the units to account for have to equal the units to account for on the bottom. So, you might as well just put in the totals so you don't make a mistake. To get to 50,000, from 10,000 to 50, your units started are going to be 40,000. To get from 3,000 to 47,000, your units started is going to be 44,000. To get from 4,000 to 47,600, your units started are going to be 43,600. And so your FIFO equivalent units have been calculated. And there you have the equivalent units for weighted average, and this will be your equivalent units for FIFO, because it's based on current production only. Now the next step is calculate cost per equivalent unit. And let's see what they give us. The costs that are relevant here are beginning WIP and costs added during June, which are current production costs. So it's basically costs for beginning WIP and current production costs, which is your top half. Those are the costs that we're concerned with. So, under work in process beginning, they tell us that direct materials are 10,000, direct labor is 1,060, and factory overhead is 1,620. Current production or costs added during June. We're not going to get into semantics. You can call it costs added to production and so on. For direct materials is 44,000, 22,440. Factory overhead is 43,600. So these are our costs. Our totals We'll put totals in because you're going to tie out to that number. So we tie out. Next, compute cost per equivalent unit. So the cost per equivalent unit under weighted average is simply taking our total cost divided by our weighted average under each column. And there's your cost per equivalent unit. And as you can see, we tie out. Simply add them. Next, allocate costs to ending WIP and units completed. Because we know our costs for the top half of our schedule. We know our beginning costs, beginning WIP costs, and we know our current production costs. So these costs here represent the top half of our matrix. Now we have to figure out our ending WIP and our units completed. So assign costs to ending WIP So what are our equivalent units for ending WIP? They are direct materials 6,000, direct labor 3,000, and factory overhead 3,600. So I'm going to put in equivalent units here and call it weighted average equivalent units. And our total cost then our weighted average cost per equivalent unit is what we computed right here, $8. So the cost ending WIP cost is simply 6,000 times 108 3,000 times 50 cents and 3,600 times 95 cents. And that's presented here. We did it across. Now we're going to take our units completed and do the same thing. Equals 44,000, which is the same for every column because it's 100%. Take the same weighted average cost per unit because it's weighted average. And just do the math. 44,000 equivalent units times the weighted average cost per unit for direct materials, cost per unit for direct labor, cost per unit for factory overhead. Which they probably have as 111,250, but I like to spread it out. Perfect. So total costs have been assigned to units completed, 111,320, and to ending WIP. So we'll put in the total there of 11,400. These two added must equal your total costs in the problem, which is given to you right here. Because all you're doing is allocating it based on a weighted average. So you're taking this 122,720 and dropping it down and allocating it to ending and completed. So let's just double check our work. And that basically tells us we did it right. We allocated 100% of the cost to ending WIP and units completed. On a T account basis, okay, your beginning WIP cost would be $12,680. Your direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead debit would be $110,040. The credit side would be your units completed, which is $111,320 on the credit. Therefore, your balance of your ending WIP inventory is going to be 11,400. So it would all tie out. Next, we will do this in a FIFO form. So the units started, current production, are going to be already going to be your equivalent units. The costs that we're concerned are going to be your current production costs. So the cost per equivalent unit under FIFO is simply going to be your current production costs divided by your FIFO equivalent units, therefore your cost per equivalent unit under FIFO is 44,000 divided by 40,000. Notice the difference. Under weighted average is $1.08 versus $1.10. Cost is 0.51 versus 50, and $1 point versus 0.95. So our cost per equivalent unit under FIFO is a little higher because our production costs versus our units started came in a little higher. So now we have to allocate, assign to ending WIP. So take the equivalent units for ending WIP keep in mind these are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. So we're keeping it all under a nice schedule. So ending WIP assignment is under FIFO. We're still using the same equivalent units of 6,000. So these numbers came from the equivalent unit of ending WIP right here in our schedule. So the cost per equivalent unit under FIFO is going to equal our current production is going to be our ending WIP 6,000 times our cost per equivalent unit FIFO that we just calculated. Now, to get to the ending WIP, units completed, do not take 44,000 multiplied by $1.10. It's not weighted average. You'll come out with the wrong answer. So just take your total costs, which is given to us in the problem. Right here are our total costs. The difference between total costs and the ending WIP FIFO that you assign is going to be completed. This is why I like to use columns, because I believe, unlike the schedule here, I believe the columns keep you organized, and it helps you basically show the flow of costs through your WIP system. So completed. So total is going to be ending WIP FIFO plus units completed FIFO, and that too equals the 122,000 of total cost. So you've allocated based on a FIFO to ending WIP 11,730 and completed costs of 110,990. Again, the FIFOs are FIFO is practically all the same, except your equivalent units are based on current units started, the current production cost divided by current units started to get your cost per equivalent unit. Then you take your ending WIP, just like you did in weighted average, multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit, and to get your completed costs, simply take your total costs that are represented in the problem and subtract your ending WIP costs. So you're essentially plugging the completed units to balance the totals once again. So again, it's not imperative that you use this type of format or the format here, as long as you get it right. But I wanted to go over this exhibit. Some of the students were talking and a little bit confused. So all the exhibit did was take your conversion costs and split it out by the direct labor in the factory overhead and gave it different percents complete. So it makes the problem just a little more work, but essentially the same steps, always the same step and the same theory. Thank you.